Creation Justice team, and to Jan Erickson. Jan, where are you at? She is here somewhere. She is here somewhere. There's Jan. Thank you so much to Jan for bringing this group to us today. Today we have Dr. Sarah Hautzinger and two of her students, McKenna Ryan, class of 2025, and Lucy Kramer, 26. And they will be talking to us this morning about, the topic is, what is the world doing about climate change? Reports from the United Nations Climate Summit. We're super excited to have them. Dr. Hautzinger is an ethnographer and a political anthropologist at Colorado College. She has developed a number of research projects in the Rocky Mountain West, all in collaboration with her students. So, Sarah told me this morning, a funny little aside, that she skipped out on her choir performance at her church. And I don't know about all of you, but I live in a house of choir members, and so that's a big ask, a big sacrifice. So we are very happy to have Sarah and her students here today. So let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, everyone. I did just miss the latter half of practice at All Souls Unitarian Universalist right up the road, not the performance, thankfully. But maybe my fellow choir members would have appreciated it if I'd not been there screeching. Yeah, shouldn't be singing soprano, right? Anyway, I wanted to, first off, thank Jan and Rob for inviting us, but really thank this extraordinary congregation. I want you all to know that we know at any number of things that are near and dear to my heart, like Colorado College itself, Communidance, Green Faith, Southern Colorado, which I'll have more to say about, but Ani Rose has been a big part of that, Jan Erickson is, that those things had the beginnings at First Congregational, and we know it. We honor that you are the incubator for so many important things in this city and this community. So, very grateful. And you know, how fitting and serendipitous that the service that we had the privilege to join you for was about debt as we turn to thinking about climate. And maybe we just want to acknowledge that this is the quintessentially slippery problem, you know, climate. It's everywhere and therefore sort of nowhere. Our efforts locally don't accrue locally. If they would accrue globally, they don't accrue. Our efforts in the present don't accrue. Now they would accrue in some sort of abstract future. And so I think, unlike so many of our pressing social justice issues, this is just a really hard one to get our heads and hearts around, even as we've known scientifically and in terms of policy what needs to happen for decades. And there are lots of other reasons why we can be in what my favorite author on this topic, Donna Haraway, called the Great Dithering. Yeah, and I also just want to invoke the other 6 students that couldn't join us today and be really grateful that McKenna and Lucy are here with me. We're going to sort of trade off, and it might be a little bit awkward, but we do awkward well. So let's go to Dubai, of all places, you know. Of the COPs that I've been at in person, the last 2 and the one that I'm hoping to take another student delegation to in Baku, Azerbaijan in November, are just beset with all kinds of ironies and contradictions. You know, oil-producing countries, authoritarian. In Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, they appointed the presiding president of that United Nations Climate Summit, their CEO of their petroleum country, who also had a real legitimate history with green energy. So we understand all of this as wrestling with contradictions and ironies. But just to say something about COPs themselves. So this COP in Dubai was extraordinary in the sense that only United Arab Emirates can host something just kind of mind-blowing in terms of the physical settings. But a COP stands for the Conference of the Parties, and the Climate COP, although it's certainly become the best known, is not the only kind of United Nations COP. Conferring the parties or the signatories to any treaty also applies to their biodiversity COPs and other freshwater COPs, other treaties that have periodic meetings. The actual United Nations framework for the Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, that treaty was written and signed in 1992, and the first COP was convened in 1995. The most important moment right after that was the Kyoto Protocols, which were, from the beginning, acknowledging that the major polluting countries, mostly wealthy countries of the global north, had a greater responsibility to curb emissions. Kyoto Protocols in 1997 are the ones that the United States of America never signed on to, and Canada was the first to withdraw from Kyoto. And so it's in subsequent COPs, the failure in Copenhagen in 2010 to get to an agreement, it was all mindful of this circumstance until we get up to the drafting of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And so the COP that we went to 8 years later was designated as a time of taking the pulse, doing a global stock take on where we stood with the Paris goals. Let's see, there are all kinds of acronyms and United Nations speak around this, and I don't think we need to go into pretty much any of that now, but suffice to say that one of the first things we do is consult the glossary and say, we need to learn all of these crazy acronyms to even follow what's going on at a COP, isn't that right? Yeah. And the big picture for this, of course, is that at the Paris COP in 2015, rethinking where are we, where do we need to go, they thought that the best they could agree to was to try to stay well below 2 degrees centigrade of warming compared to pre-industrial baselines. And the story is that a young woman, I wish I had written down her name because I don't have it with me, but a young woman from one of the low-lying Pacific Asian island states stood up and said, how can you be talking about 2 degrees when we know that anything more than 1.5 consigns us to beyond calamity, extinction, possibly even. And I invoke that only to remind us that it was one youth voice that got us to that goal. We are not on target, and yet we are flattening the curve. I'll say a little bit more about that in a sec. Who goes to COPs? All of the 92 signatory nations, and when it comes to Dubai, many, many more. Let's see what I have here. So this is a picture that of the world leaders. We see the gentleman in the front in the white robes is actually the man I referred to, the president of COP28, Sultan El Jabbar, who, as I mentioned, has also led the National Petroleum country. And I'm not sure exactly why this particular photograph is in right here where it is, but there's Lucy walking along. Are you going to jump in? Come on.
Yeah, I can jump in more for like who's at COP, and maybe we could go into like the zones and stuff too.
Sure.
But yeah, so there's kind of the green and blue zones at COP, and the, I'm gonna get the colors wrong, but in where the negotiators are.
Blue.
Okay, thank you. It's like slightly arbitrary, but that's where kind of all the party members and all the member constituencies are there, as well as different members from observers, and it's kind of like hard to get your tickets into the negotiation zones where they're gonna hash out the details of what's in the final text that move forward for each year. But in the green zone and also throughout the blue zone, there's a lot of different companies, businesses, consultancy firms, and they have definitely a big role in like kind of advertising their different things going on. And there's also a lot of different advocates from all sorts of fields, medical professionals, researchers, that want to either have their voice heard or want to report back about the COP.
Yes, and our delegation from Colorado College is part of the approved observer organizations, and what that is the effort to make sure that civil society is heard. I'm going to skip ahead actually to give you some sense of the numbers at COP 28. It literally more than doubled. We had just under 100,000 attendees badged in the blue zone in person, and then another 3,000 or so to make 100,000 virtually. And there was a lot of controversy about that. Is this getting too big? Is it becoming a trade show? And especially, are we getting distracted from the negotiations and from the implementation of the goals of the Paris Agreement? But sticking with the observer organizations for just a moment, we were countering sometimes, look, there are only 14,000 of us from the observer organizations, and if you look down a few, overflow, the parties themselves, the governmental representatives and negotiators, were 24,000, but overflow from the parties was last year was 28,000 people. And so we, of the observer organizations, were also saying, we're not the problem, we're not the reason you can wait for 3 hours and then get kicked out of a negotiation because the parties have preference. But back to the observer organizations, we, as the Colorado College delegation, is part of that big blue one, RINGO, which is research and independent NGOs or non-governmental organizations. You know, you got your, the biggest one, ENGO, is environmental NGOs. BINGO is business. There's farmers, indigenous peoples organizations, local government and municipal authorities, women and gender, trade unions, and youth are some of the 9 civil society delegations. It's not easy to get approved observer status. A predecessor of mine, Mark Smith, in economics, did that with Colorado College. And then even if you are approved, getting badges can be quite elusive, and some people say completely arbitrary. I am not sure why the COP gods have smiled upon Colorado College. We initially received last year 9 in-person badges. We've often split those, so a student might be badged for 1 week, and then that badge goes to someone else the following week. To give you some idea, though, University of Colorado at Boulder, have you heard of it? It's up the road. It's a little bigger than Colorado College. They got 2 badges. The American Anthropological Association that I'm part of, with a membership of, I'm not sure what our total membership is right now, but it's something like 60,000, got 3 badges. Colorado College eventually got up to 12, and so I was able to badge all of our students full-time, but then each of us gave badges to often youth leaders from the Global South, et cetera, to make sure that they had some kind of access to the blue zone, but just to give you some notion about how coveted that is. And then when our students weren't in the blue zone, you could be in the green zone, which is the one that is open up to the public and is usually more for the host country and others who might come. And then there are all kinds of off-site events as well, like a New York Times forum that students have made much of as well. I think we want to talk a little bit about is the COP getting too big? Is having a big tent that's very, very inclusive working to get the work done? Or is it getting off course? One piece of that maybe is something that the Women and Gender constituency has been looking at very closely, that in 2008, only 30% of the negotiators were women, but well over a decade, 15 years later, that went all the way up to 34%. And as you know, the United Nations really takes gender representativity very seriously. And so this is just why we're not doing a very good job in terms of really being inclusive and making sure that less powerful, more marginalized voices are heard. I think you have more to say about that, McKenna. Do you want to come up, or?
Since you're going to have to switch it in a second,
Okay.
I'll just stick here. Yeah, so this is something that I do have slightly mixed opinions about. I think that, as Sarah was kind of mentioning about kind of the demographics of party versus overflow versus observers, and one thing that I don't believe you mentioned as well is there was a very large attendance from fossil fuel lobbyists at this COP, the most that have ever gone to a COP. And so sort of reflecting on that, it's a little bit difficult for me to justify the size personally, just because I don't feel like we are necessarily representing the right people. I also, similarly with kind of those badges, I do question and do feel a little bit guilty, honestly, about the level of access we did get to have. Again, we did try our best to kind of leverage that access and extend that access to other communities, but I do question a little bit kind of where the UN is coming from in regards to who they're giving access to these spaces. So while I think it is really useful and I really appreciate trying to extend access to as many people as possible and making this a truly global event, I don't think that the UN is currently succeeding at that goal with the demographics of people that are currently coming. I think that there is not a lot of diversity, and they're not really succeeding with inclusion at this point, is my view.
And I would say that there's an insane amount of different people who come to COP, but structurally it's segregated in terms of the negotiators, the people making the decisions, are in this one building. COP is this giant, expansive landscape, and all the negotiations are happening in one building until like 3 a.m. at the very end. And it's only those kind of party members normally that stick around until those last hours and get, the final words thrown in. And I was observing with an expert researcher who's been at COPs for years, and they were mentioning that it's about the structural kinds of participation that all the diverse members need to show up and really incorporate themselves and as advocates in the negotiations, as opposed to just the side event space and the more public areas, but really trying to be part of the negotiation process that, as Sarah mentioned, it's important to keep central because those are the texts that are moving forward and kind of the global order.
Yeah, and maybe just to defend a little bit what it means to have young people like these two involved in this. They learned from getting taken under the wing of other researchers and activists. It matters to have you. These two were there at 3 a.m. Observer organizations holding negotiators' feet to the fire, right? So, and also it was important for me to have my students remind me that you walk in and you realize, oh, UNFCCC is also basically a neo-colonial enterprise, if you think about it. And I'd gotten kind of accustomed to that. Well, welcome to the world that we're working in, and we don't have much time. We have to work from where we are. But what would it mean to re-envision the United Nations in such a way that the very wealthy nations that have disproportional responsibility for our climate crisis were also not so dominant in terms of the decision-making? Yeah, I don't know if you saw, we got the lobbyist slide up there with the 2,400 lobbyists. That's the other question, is should all these fossil fuel lobbyists be left at the be at the table diluting language? Everyone who has been working on this, including the presidents of the UNFCCC and the United Nations, are saying we need language that phases out fossil fuels, and we have not gotten there. COP28 was a huge move forward in the sense that we even mention fossil fuels in the language of the global stock take. 3 times, I think it gets mentioned. It is not in the Paris Agreement, talking about fossil fuels in particular. But the language, because of this dilution effect, only went to move decisively away from using fossil fuels. And the just transition piece of that complicates it, because people in developing countries say, oh, you're going to say that we can't even use the resources we have when you all are the ones who need to stop burning, right? So it is a complex issue, but we've not gotten quite to phase out language, and a lot of people attribute it to this dilution and this foot dragging that the influence, particularly of fossil fuel corporations and lobbyists, can have. Gentlemen, did you want to come in?
So from what I gathered from this is if you're an observer in a negotiation, again, the researcher that's really pushing, like, observers need to be there. First of all, is just like having someone watching, like, puts the pressure on, like, you can't just say anything. Like, you literally can see which countries are arguing for what. And so, you know, for instance, when the US in one of the negotiations was like, we don't like the language Mother Earth, like, someone is there, like, keeping them accountable and, like, can share that that's their perspective. And again, this researcher shared with me, like, as a negotiators are, like, getting coffee at, like, 1 a.m., like, you can go talk to them. And, like, I talked to several, like, negotiators, like, just had a casual conversation with this Brazilian agriculture negotiator. And I think just having that presence and talking about what we're studying there, the things that we're thinking about, and having that interaction is, like, very meaningful, you know, to share, like, we're observers, we have this perspective, and to have that interaction, like, I think that does have an impact. Yeah. But different kinds of observers will be doing various different things depending on, like, what your goal is there. And
I think what you're getting at is something that we've really focused on as a class, and something that I think you're particularly really good about is kind of like that human interaction level at the COP of sometimes people that are at the negotiation level, that are really high level at NGOs, things like that, are really concerned about directly representing the interests of their company, and they kind of aren't able to, present themselves as individuals. And that's something that I think, observers really are able to do. Also, to highlight something that you said and add on to it a little bit, there's some spaces where media are just not allowed in to negotiations, but observers are. And so that is something where it is really helpful, where, you know, you might not necessarily be able to take photos or write an article about it, but you know what happened, and you are able to then go and share that information again on a human level. So really just that accountability and kind of that connection is really the intention of observers.
Yeah, it's a critical question. I'm not really sure, again, why this photo of the group was there, but it speaks to what we think we're doing there. We don't take lightly what it means to get on a fossil fuel emitting jet and fly to a climate conference. But of the 50 students that applied to join the 8 that we brought last year, once we'd made the selection, we said, this is not a class. It is also a class, But first and foremost, you are part of the Colorado College delegation, the only delegation from Colorado Springs, at least that I know of, and your job is to do some of what we're doing right now, to continue to engage your local communities to make this the world's efforts to the extent that we can. And so that's another piece, not just the influence that an observer might have during the negotiation, but the dissemination and the continuing to knit back to local communities. We did get around a little bit in Dubai, and I think we had really mixed feelings about Dubai as a host in other ways, just because it's a very glitzy, we have the tallest building in the world's biggest Ferris wheel, etc. We went out on a desert safari that turned out, and the students very rightfully said, we don't want to do dune jumping because it's very environmentally damaging. Still, we were basically doing these sideways things all over these dunes with rock and roll blaring. We thought, at least when we do the little boat tour around the island, it'll be quiet. Nope, it was all high excitement and glitz, but that goes along with it. But the point is, we do not treat this as a kind of academic tourism. When we take students, we don't take it lightly, and we ask each of them, how are you going to justify what it means to get access to something like this? Yeah, we're going to talk now a little bit more about what we as anthropologists and ethnographers were doing at the COP. Do you want to come up here? Yeah, okay, come on up. Finally, get off stage.
So yeah, our class was there as event ethnographers, and anthropology is like the discipline of studying human societies, and we're all from the sociocultural lens, so kind of using ethnography to study the world we live in, different times and spaces. So event ethnography of the COP then was us going there to see like what is going on right now and kind of take historical record. And use different methods like researching beforehand and afterward, participant observation, being there, talking to people, sitting at the different events, seeing what the feeling we get on that is. And you can use several methods, but that's the idea, is like really get and immerse in a space to get the most deep understanding you can. And I feel like that's a very unique thing at COP. And again, when I was talking to that negotiator, he brought up these feelings that COP is a historical space of the past 500 years of global relations that are now playing out. And I think when people go to their jobs and go to things like COPs, again, almost everyone has a certain agenda that you want as an advocate or as a negotiator for your country or whatever. And the event ethnographer perspective is kind of aside from that, but just to get a holistic understanding of, well, what even is the project happening of COPs in general? Like, as Sarah mentioned, how that can 100% be a continuation of neo-colonial relations. And a lot of that gets brought up at COP, but that was just part of our task, is to apply a critical lens to all the things that were happening and not just accept them. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, so kind of for the class portion of this, because again, like, you know, this was a class that we were getting credit and getting graded on. So each of us was doing sort of individual research and was writing a final essay on that, which we'll get into kind of what we ended up focusing on. We were doing that, and then we were also writing some more like short, small-scale blogs as well. So each of us did like, I did 2, I'm sure Lucy did like 5, but all of us did at least 2 on lots of various different topics. So I ended up writing the Holy See and the Catholic Church had a really unique perspective at COP28, where they were really focused on non-economic loss and damages. The COP has this very financial focus. It's difficult sometimes to justify the harm that's being done if they can't put a monetary value on it, and that's something that I think is really fundamentally flawed with the COP personally. And so the Holy See was kind of advocating for there's actually a lot of really profound spiritual harm that's being done, and that actually might be more relevant and more important than the financial harms that are being done here. So I went to that event, I wrote a little bit about that, and then I also wrote a piece kind of reflecting at the end of the COP kind of about where things ended up with the US, and how it was generally not fantastic, and I felt very let down, and kind of my experience being a US delegate in that space. So just to kind of give you an idea of all these little snippets that we did kind of throughout the COP as well. So we tried to do as much like community engagement and reflection as possible while we were there.
Yeah. And then should I go into my 6.8 maybe a little bit as my focus?
Should I say something about, is this still on? No.
Yeah, there you go.
Something about some of the bright spots of this COP. Do you want to go back to that loss and damage protest while we're at it?
Sure.
So as I probably, you all are here because you follow this. So at the outset, the first 2 days of COP28, they did arrive at an agreement on loss and damage, how exactly the financing for communities that have already lost lands, other assets, will be compensated financially. And as McKenna alludes to, this is all in very economistic principles. But that was very trumpeted as historic to arrive at an agreement right at the outset that the World Bank, again, lots of ironies we don't need to go into other than to remember that there's a whole movement, 50 years is enough of World Bank leading development, but that the World Bank was going to oversee that fund, both in terms of its aggregation and its dissemination, and that was a big deal. What became, I guess, some other bright spots that came out of not even this COP, but the whole UNFCCC process that are worth mentioning are that just 15 years ago, we were in a trajectory that was towards 5 degrees Celsius of warming. Now we are at about 2.5. Some of the numbers on this vary depending on whom you're speaking with. We might be heading toward the first year in 2024 where we are actually going to see a reduction in global emissions. But many critics have also said, we're really proud of the fact that we're just decreasing the rate of increase of emissions, but they still have been successfully rising as fast as our implementation of renewables. So again, that's a mixed bag. We also know that last year, 2023, was the first year that the United States of America reduced our net emissions to the extent that we're tracking them well, which we know is fallible, but improving, by 1.4% in a year that we had 2.4% of economic growth. And so there are some successes and achievements and bright spots coming out of this work, even as we can bemoan that we're not on track to 1.5, we're not even on track to below 2 degrees of warming at this point. And yet, I think the closer up to these processes that I get, this was my 4th COP in person, and I've been focused on all of this for about the last 8 years exclusively. Closer up, one starts to see these achievements that are extraordinarily, mind-bogglingly difficult. And so I like to try to point out to my cynical or surprised students at how much the historical legacies encumber this process, that we do have some achievements that are very important to acknowledge.
Yeah, just like on that note, and I can go into, I kind of came in with that perspective that everything was going to be very encumbered by, the historical legacy, and it was going to be very much focused in this pretty like rigid Western way, but what I ended up focusing on was the 6.8 non-market approaches to NDC collaboration, which literally took me all month and after to figure out what that meant. But basically the nationally determined contributions is what each country is going to do about climate change. And as Sarah might know from being there from the COPs previous, that was mainly led by the carbon markets and carbon pricing, which are all market approaches. So countries were, what was even attempting to get onto the contributions from each country was basically about how can we like profit off of the carbon, like reducing carbon, which also has its value, as this COP brought up, in terms of giving a new sort of value to environmental things and like including environmental impact in our like money value, which definitely has its benefit. But at this COP, what actually passed was the non-market approaches. So that's this new space emerging for countries and local members to participate, and how do we want our nationally distributed contributions to change and evolve in ways that aren't just market-based. So it's really open to everyone, and honestly, this is where local communities can participate also.
And it passed.
Yeah, it passed. And the other ones, which had been the market-based ones that had been driven and had been passing and continuing, they actually didn't pass. Those ones lagged at this COP in order for this non-market approaches to kind of get a new footing, which is super important to slow down that process and allow new things to emerge that can be much more holistic.
Yeah, I think even though I am very, very critical of the COP as an institution and as of its colonial roots and how deeply enshrined it is in like capitalist thinking and all of that, I will admit that this year, and I've obviously only been to one COP, so if you want to speak to this, I really did feel like there was kind of this shift and this new reckoning of like, we can't just be thinking about this in terms of money. This isn't a resource issue. We have what we need to figure this out. It's a matter of political will, and it's a matter of spiritual will. It's a matter of caring about this enough to decide to put our money towards it. And so I think that that's something that we're seeing become more mainstream sort of in these conversations, and I am hopeful of how that will kind of continue going forward.
Maybe are you ready to go?
Oh,
Go,
yeah.
Jump in there.
Okay. Should I talk about Zeraces maybe? Like,
Sure, that'd be great.
yeah, this, we weren't really aware what the sermon was going to be about today, and it was incredibly beautiful and perfect to lead into this because, again, like money really is at like the base and core of what people are experiencing all around the whole world. And like I mentioned about the 500 years of history, countries that are more affected by climate change have also been more historically like targeted economically for various reasons, including colonization. And the debt that was caused by that, like so many countries are trapped in, which also hinders their ability to adapt to climate change and all these things. And one of our students that went to COP really focused on that in the World Bank's things, and thinking about, well, what if that debt could be forgiven like every 7 years, as the sermon mentioned? Like that kept coming to my mind at COP, like, why can't we just forgive these debts and move forward? Because countries are still being kind of attacked for these historical legacies. And how the sustainability like movement and climate change is also kind of an opening for that, where huge banks that are lending to countries that are more vulnerable are thinking about new ways to think about value again, like the social benefit to those countries. That has to be included for like lending projects, not just that the lenders are going to get rich off of that investment. Like what's good for society, what's good for the environment? Like these are questions that we're trying to work out at COP in these spaces, but it's a very like deeply philosophical problem that's also now economic. So. Yeah.
All right. So I would like to talk a little bit about kind of where my research focus ended up. So I went into the COP thinking maybe I'll think about climate finance, maybe I'll think about indigenous peoples. I'm not super sure where I'm going to go. And Lucy ended up being a lot more focused on negotiations. I ended up attending a lot of side events, which are just essentially panels. Sometimes they're a little bit more roundtable discussions from experts on various topics. And so I ended up attending a lot of side events, particularly that were led by Indigenous peoples. And through doing that, one idea that I found to be really central in my own kind of thinking about climate is this idea, again, that it's not a resource issue, it's kind of an idea issue, and that these ideas that we're working with and kind of taking for granted on this UN level are a little bit flawed. We are only really considering Western white ideas on this large scale. And so getting to hear Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous epistemologies was something that was really transformational for me, to kind of think about these different ways of being in connection with the earth that could be healing and could really help us in this fight. So before I get into it, I just want to say that there is this tendency sometimes, especially among white climate activists, to kind of romanticize Indigenous ways of thinking and overgeneralize, and that's not my intention here. I don't want to commodify these ways of thinking. I just want to kind of put it out there as an alternative and kind of stimulate your thinking about maybe there's another way that we could be doing this. So there is this need, in my view, to fundamentally redefine the way that we think about our relationship with nature and with each other. Right now, there's this kind of dominant idea that we should just develop new technologies to continue the way that we are currently engaging with the world. We can continue to overconsume. We can continue to buy new clothes every year and just throw them in a landfill. But if we maybe have hydrogen cars, then maybe it'll have less emissions. I think it's necessary to fundamentally rethink that relationship and start living a little bit more sustainably in relationship with the other people in our lives, with ourselves, and with nature. And that's something that Indigenous peoples tend to advocate for a little bit more, that kind of reciprocal relationship. The reason why this is something that still is kind of marginal in UN spaces is because Indigenous peoples are not UN member parties. That means that they are not able to really have voice in negotiations. They're not able to vote. They are just observer parties. So they're part of that Indigenous peoples NGO. And this is something that is really inequitable because Indigenous tribes are nations. You know, we know the way that those relationships are constructed. In North America in particular is what we're most familiar with, and they have their own governments, they have their own societies, and yet they are still just lumped into the broader American constituency and are rarely, if ever, represented as negotiators within that constituency. So what a lot of tribes are really advocating for at the UN is to become UN member states. And so that's something that would really allow them to, you know, have more of a voice. So that's where I ended up focusing and kind of how giving Indigenous peoples more of a voice would really shape this process so it's a little bit more equitable, because as we've said, it is fundamentally not. So, yeah. Do you want to go to yours?
Here's that. I'm mindful of the time because I really want to open up. So forgive me, I'm going to go real fast here. Just to say that my colleagues at Colorado College in environmental science and studies and across campus really had a lot of this work already dialed in, and when I turned to it, I started asking, what new function is not? And I started writing syllabi with very new learning objectives to me, things like resisting paralysis and despair, building response abilities, the ability to stay responsive, really working on kind of the affective and in some ways the spiritual aspects of this work. We have been convening Talanoa Dialogues, which is an Asian Pacific storytelling and conflict resolution process that is, these are legendary in political anthropology, but not usually elsewhere. But Fiji brought the Talanoa dialogue to the COP in 2017, right when the United States had at least tacitly withdrawn from the Paris Accord. And even though it should have been the most disparaging moment of all, everyone says about that COP that was held in Bonn, Germany, but Fiji was the presiding host, that indigenous voices, youth voices, women's voices, Global South voices were heard in a way that had never happened before, that really broke from United Nations speak, UN East as usual. And people left so inspired to keep convening these dialogues at subsequent global summits, but all the way to local communities. And we now have, let's see, Lucy's been convening them even this semester, so I think I've now participated in 12 different Talanoa dialogues, and lo and behold, it turns out that a lot of other groups, including the faith-based coalitions, have been convening Talanoa dialogues before each COP. There's one actually with Aliku Sadiq, a new PhD who had just spoken, listening as Lucy gives her Talanoa. There's a panel with McKenna Ryan on it where we were connecting the Sustainable Development Goals to the SDGs, to the IDGs, the Inner Development Goals, and really asking what kinds of work do I need to do in terms of my relationship with myself, my community, and on up, to be able to be more effective in this very challenging work. I'm just going to skip through a few. That's the Talanoa dialogues. But then I wanted to end with saying something about the faith-based organizing all the way from the COPs. This is an image of Green Faith International, an organization that's an interfaith climate justice global organization that I first did a training with at the COP in Madrid in 2019. And that kind of work with Green Faith that has really focused on organizing. Increasingly, they're working on following the money, doing protests at BlackRock, Bank of America, Citibank, Vanguard, that are still supporting new fossil fuel projects and infrastructure. And all of this work kind of percolates outward, including to Colorado Springs. Our circle of Green Faith, SoCo, or Southern Colorado, has held press conferences on the steps of City Hall. First Congregational might remember before a COP a couple years ago that we did the appealing of the bells up and down the corridors to call people into the work of climate justice in an interfaith respect. At the COPs, COP28 had the first faith-based pavilion of their own, and a great deal more faith voices. And then it really touches on what McKenna was talking about, and Lucy, about what do we need to think about beyond the market principles pieces. The faith-based groups in particular at the COPs are the ones who have said, loss and damage, all well and good, we need that fund. But without serious mitigation, prevention of the much greater catastrophes that are coming, that is blood money, is a quote from the leader of Green Faith International. And so it's the faith-based organizations that have said, we need to talk more about human rights violations in terms of climate effects. And not just put it into the economistic language. Not instead of, because we need both, but we need to talk about it in terms of human rights, and that's really come from the faith-based voice that can really prioritize and center the ethical and moral issues at stake here. SoCo folks are starting to work more with, say, this is the group from Together Colorado, another faith-based network locally that is doing work. So we're always kind of starting and stopping with Green Faith SoCo because our day jobs get in the way, but First Cong has been involved in that. We're looking forward to another vibrant chapter on that. And then as far as the students go, this was out on our desert safari. It's been important to keep tabs on each of y'all and what having an opportunity like this is going, how it's going to shape how you contribute as citizens going forward. So thanks so much for your attention, and love to hear any thoughts or questions you all have.
Testing.
So I had another question. Why was there such an explosion of people at this last COP? Was it more interest groups, and or is it more countries that are participating? Like, who was it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the previous year's COP in Egypt had also had a doubling up to 50,000, and it looks like it's largely having to do with the host countries inviting in, that party overflow. But say Brazil has always been right behind each of the host countries, Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, and Brazil will host not this year's COP, but COP number 30 in 2025. And so I think that's the Brazilians preparing, and also Brazilian engagement with that. So that's part of it, but the critical attention is pretty much gone to why are we having so many fossil fuel lobbyists at a COP. And again, I don't know that it's intrinsically a bad thing, although it creates its logistical challenges. The piece about participation is a question, though, because each COP, they're supposed to rotate across the world's regions so that it can be inclusive. And it's getting to be that only big cities, only a few cities in the world can host this COP. I guess the SB implementation, the subsidiary body implementation chair was saying, we in Pakistan would love to host a COP. That would be very appropriate given our lowland losses, and we don't see how we ever could unless they're reined in.
Need a microphone. I'm a teacher. I can interject, but okay, here we go. Two things. First of all, thank you so much for working in the affective aspect of this. So I have a kiddo at that two-badge university up the street, and he feels despair when he thinks about it. Despair and what's the word I want? Futility. Second of all, I'm curious if there's enforcement mechanisms or punishments for individual countries that are not meeting their goals. It seems to me that this is a UN thing. Yeah, right. There's not a lot of rights without remedies,
Right. I mean, there can be ostensibly things like boycotts or sanctions, and yet that is what we all bemoan about the United Nations as a whole. There are no real teeth or any centralized authority that's going to enforce that, and therefore it tends to be opt-in, and therefore depending on kind of goodwill and willingness, and that's part of why many of us are wanting to continually center the moral and ethical pieces. But say, why is it going to be in Azerbaijan next year? It needed to be in Central Europe. And guess who kept vetoing many of the proposals like that? From Bulgaria was the lead proposal. One guy named Vladimir Putin, because Azerbaijan had not been gotten crossways with Vlad, right? Because I think Bulgaria had both expressed sympathy with Ukraine and been nestling up to NATO and the EU. And so the geopolitics, who's on the Security Council, who has the vetoes on the Security Council, continues to be, I'd say, the biggest sort of neo-colonial element of UN organization, and that's as close as we come to any kind of teeth. Maybe those who are more well-informed could add to that question, because that, in some ways, is the question about why we're in the great dithering and why we're not on track.
Hi. I don't know much about geopolitics and climate, but I have a question that's more national. What is your opinion of why our esteemed government is pushing the expensive notion of an electric car instead of a hybrid, which I have and has worked for the me and the climate for 10 years. Why aren't they pushing hybrids, which are more affordable for one and all?
I don't have an answer to that. The reason that I moved from a hybrid to an electric vehicle is because my youngest daughter told me, "Mom, I'm taking your hybrid to school, and I'll pay you for it." But no, I don't have. I know that a lot of people will talk about how we talk about electric vehicles as if it's a panacea, and we don't talk enough about critical metals and the labor abuses, even enslavement that critical metals like lithium are dependent upon. But if you were of a hard line that everyone should be phasing out fossil fuels, or at least everyone in the major historically emitting countries like the United States, then you would say an EV would be the way to go, I suppose, more than a hybrid.
I also think that they were talking about like going for that extreme so that like the technology develops and the market develops to like lower the price. And, you know, like obviously anything going in that direction is better. And then, you know, another critique of like the US's agenda that I noticed at COP2 is, yeah, why not even push for more public transportation? Like even way harder than any kind of vehicle, which is still so much more participating in metal mining and like carbon in whatever form.
Well, it's the top of the hour, so I want to be sensitive to your time and our guest time. I want to thank Sarah and her student team and for bringing this vital message to us all. So thank you so much.
All right, look forward to continuing conversations with many of you.